communities that are working in the newborn screening space. So Dr. Powell.
Thanks very much, Annie. And thank you to the Every Life Foundation and Baby's First Test for the invitation to join you today. It's a pleasure to be here. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give a brief overview of the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, how it got started, how things currently work, and then go on to what are some of the proposed changes that are being considered. The Advisory Committee was established in 2003. And that was at the time when there was a large discrepancy in the number of conditions that states were screening for in newborns, with some having gone already to the use of tandem mass spec, which greatly increased the number of conditions, whereas other states were still only screening for maybe 5, 6, or 7 conditions. So an advisory panel, expert panel that was funded by HRSA, and was led by Dr. Rodney Howell and Dr. Michael Watson, representing the American College of Medical Genetics, and included experts in newborn screening types of conditions. And they established a core panel of 29 conditions and 29 secondary conditions, meaning those that would be picked up in screening for the core panel of conditions. The secretary approved that panel, and at that time the RUSP, the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel, was established in 2010. The committee has been funded, along with many other things, through the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act, which was enacted in 2007, began in 2008. Since the committee has been established, additional conditions have been added that are severe combined immunodeficiency, critical congenital heart disease, Pompe disease, Hurler syndrome, X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy, and the last condition added to the panel was spinal muscular atrophy. Unfortunately, in 2019, although the House passed the reauthorization for the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act, the Senate did not pass. So we had to sort of reform the committee, and it's now essentially a discretionary advisory committee that is still able to work, but is not able to do all the things that we'd like to because of the failure of the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act to be reauthorized. Next slide, please. So some of the essentials regarding newborn screening and how the committee really was formed and initially decided all the different parameters to use and thinking about new conditions to add to the RUSP were based on several reports ranging from the World Health Organization in 1968 to the ACMG panel that was published in Genetics and Medicine Toward a Uniform Screening Panel is the title of that, and that was in 2006. Next slide, please. So the report from the National Research Council stated that mandated screening could be justified only if there was evidence that it would prevent death or other serious harm to the affected individual, and that procedural guidance must exist in order to maximize the effectiveness of genetic screening programs. Next slide. The Institute of Medicine report stated that as basic principles to govern newborn screening, the committee recommends that such screening take place only when there is a clear indication of benefit to the newborn, that a system is in place to confirm the diagnosis, and that treatment and follow-up are available for affected newborns. Next slide. And currently there are 35 core conditions on the RUSP and 26 secondary conditions. And those you can find on the HRSA committee, ACT-DNC committee website. Next slide. So the RUSP is a list of conditions recommended by the Secretary of Health and Human Services for states to screen for as part of their state universal newborn screening programs. Conditions on the RUSP are chosen based on evidence that supports the potential net benefit of screening, and we'll have a chance to talk more about that later, the ability of states to screen for the disorder, and the availability of effective treatments. It's recommended that every newborn be screened for all conditions on the RUSP. Next slide. Most states screen for the majority of disorders on the RUSP. Newer conditions are still in the process of adoption, but it's really left up to individual states as to what conditions they will screen for. Some states screen for additional conditions that are not on the RUSP. And although states ultimately determine what conditions their newborn screening program will screen for, the RUSP establishes a standardized list of disorders that have been supported by the committee and the Secretary of HHS. Next slide. And this is a basic overview of how the process works. Once a condition is submitted, a nomination package is submitted to HRSA for review. HRSA sometimes sends it back because it's incomplete. There's certain things missing. So they'll send it back. Then the nomination package can be resubmitted. After HRSA goes through and sees that all the elements are there, then there's what's called the Nomination and Prioritization Work Group, which is made up of members of the full committee. I think 5 members from the full committee, and they review the package, and then they present it to the full committee that then votes. And either the committee votes to move it forward for a full evidence-based review, or they vote that it's not ready for full evidence review and send it back, providing guidance to those who have submitted the nomination to let them know how the nomination can be strengthened. If it is voted through, then an outside group, currently headed by Dr. Alex Kemper, who runs the Evidence Review Work Group, and they have 9 months to do a full evidence-based review of that condition. Their results, findings are then presented to the full committee that then votes whether to approve the condition for the RUSP or not approve, in which case, again, the group that's given the nomination is provided feedback as to how the nomination can be strengthened. If it's approved by the committee, then it goes to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who may request additional information or approve it. And then if the Secretary approves it, it would then be added to the RUSP. Next slide, please. So for the condition review process, a group that is considering putting forth a nomination package should form a multidisciplinary team. The team should include researchers and or clinicians with expertise on the condition being nominated, advocacy and or professional organizations with knowledge of the issues relevant to newborn screening, and interested consumers and individuals. Next slide. As I mentioned, then the Nomination and Prioritization Work Group looks at the package that should include a cover letter, letters of support from as many individuals as would be pertinent. There's disclosure forms that have to be completed, responses to the nomination form, specific questions that are asked on the form, and then supporting data and scientific clinical references to substantiate all the responses to the nomination form questions. And the current nomination form is found at the link provided there. Next slide. So in order to submit a nomination, the requirements are that there must be a validated laboratory test, widely available confirmatory testing with a sensitive and specific diagnostic test, and a prospective population-based pilot study. Next slide. As I said, HRSA then reviews the package for completeness, and again, the nomination and prioritization work group goes before the committee to present, or I'm sorry, goes before the committee to present their findings, and then the committee votes on whether or not to move it forward for evidence-based review. Next slide. The external condition review work group completes a systematic evidence-based review, provides updates to the committee, and presents a final report to the committee on the assigned condition. The committee deliberates and votes on the condition, and the committee uses a decision matrix to guide their final decision. And as I mentioned, the secretary makes the final decision on whether or not to add or not the condition to the RUSP. Next slide. Basically, the highlights of the matrix that's used are indicated here. First of all, whether there's net benefit to the population of newborns screened. Is there a high certainty of that net benefit, or a moderate certainty, or higher moderate certainty that the targeted condition would lead to small or zero net benefit? And then are states capable to offer this newborn screening? Are state labs and the whole state newborn screening system, is it ready to add this condition to their state panel? Next slide, please. And this is what the decision matrix looks like. It's a bit complicated. I won't go through all of it, but certainly available there. But essentially, those are the highlights: the readiness and the net benefit. Is there net benefit, and what's the certainty of that net benefit? Next slide, please. So now to go on to why we have been considering changes to this process. In February, HRSA convened an expert advisory panel to address the process through which a condition is considered for or included in the RUSP. It was felt that it would be important to inform the committee about ways to strengthen the evidence review and decision-making process, since the current process had been in place for several years already. And also, it was recognized that we needed to develop consumer-friendly guidance to enhance the transparency about the process and any changes. Next slide. So the areas that we're focused on included the nomination form itself and the process, the evidence-based review, the decision matrix, and what I'm not going to talk about today was including a review of conditions that are already on the RUSP. So something that we have not been doing, but was under consideration. Next slide. So the guiding questions were: what issues or changes are needed in the committee process? What are the next steps needed? How can we address these issues? Which actions can be done immediately, and which would need further discussion, additional research, or changes in policy? Next slide. And this was the timeline beginning in February of 2019 up until our last meeting in August, where the final report was presented to the committee, and the committee was given a summary of proposed next steps, and the committee will vote on these changes at our next meeting in November. Next slide. So here's a summary of the issues that were identified. Next slide. So in terms of revisiting the nomination process, the issue was guidance about the process from HRSA or the committee is limited about the process itself or specific criteria considered for nominations. The actionability is that consumer guidance and nomination frequently asked questions will be posted or developed and posted on the committee's website in the coming fiscal year. The next issue was that information requested from the nomination form does not directly link to specific and relevant information needed for the evidence review in areas such as registries, unpublished evidence, screening algorithm and resources, long-term follow-up, etc. And again, revisions proposed for the nomination form are in place, and the new nomination form will be posted in fiscal year 22. Next slide. The issue being that no systematic review or landscape scan is given in the nomination package. The information that the nomination and prioritization work group has to go on could potentially be biased, not so much intentionally, but the fact that, you know, those who are putting in a nomination package are generally folks who are, you know, very favorable to adding their condition to the RUSP. Given the limited time that we have for these evidence reviews, there was discussion and recommendation they have a scoping review that the NNP work group would give. However, that would require development of new procedures. It would be quite time intensive, and no committee action was taken at that time. It was felt that there would be further discussion about that, having this scoping review of a condition before it's presented to the committee and before it's decided whether or not to go forward with the full in-depth evidence review. Next slide. Assessing the published evidence. So this is a real challenge for extremely rare conditions, often where there isn't much published information available. The evidence review group does utilize what's called gray information that might be an abstract or a poster presentation at a national meeting, but something that has not undergone rigorous peer review and published in the medical literature. So the problems related to some of that include that the case definition is not always clear. Like, what is the condition that newborn screening would be intended to detect? The case definition should specify screening targets and be cognizant of the screening procedures, and that changes in the case definition based on evidence should be raised early in the review and presented to the committee. Also, that critical outcomes are dependent on the availability of evidence. So what are the critical outcomes that should be assessed and considered in terms of the net benefit of doing newborn screening for this condition? Also that the patient or family or other values were not always being considered, and information was not available on them. So the committee processes in fiscal year 22 will be adopted with critical outcomes identified up front. And there was further discussion about ranking stakeholder importance, about how rankings could be gathered, whose rankings, looking at the input from the committee, family, general public, and other stakeholders in terms of their thoughts about newborn screening for a condition. Next slide. Also assessing the unpublished evidence. There are things that are ready for implementation. The review group will expand their current procedures for assessing the gray literature, incorporating other methods available to use some of the expert-derived evidence that may be unpublished once relevant meeting abstracts or other unpublished resources are identified. And then looking at additional data such as data in registries, and hopefully we'll have more time to discuss that in the discussion part of this meeting. Next slide, please. Thinking about what are the costs of implementing a new condition, in terms of how states can be assessed for their readiness to begin a new condition. Some new steps are being incorporated into the survey. There's a new survey form that's been developed. The first time it will be used will be in the review process for MPS II, Hunter syndrome, and hopefully that will gather additional information that will be valuable in terms of the public health system impact. Next slide. And revisiting the decision matrix, no major changes are being made. However, there have been discussions about the B rating where there's moderate certainty of net benefit, but there may be not a lot of information available at that time. And we plan to have further discussions about that to develop, maybe break down additionally the B ratings. Next slide. And then again, some of the other discussion was about the yes or no in the decision matrix. You know, some of the recent conditions have had some uncertainty. We felt that further research was needed. However, not wanting to delay adding a condition for what could be, you know, 2 or 3 more years. And so we're still thinking about ways to further sort of think about this. It was the committee has voted no to adding to the RUSP and provided further requirements, such as initially when SCID was reviewed and the first review for GAMT, and that there may not be any changes needed. However, that I think will still warrant additional discussion in the future. Another problem certainly is we see many more treatments under development for rare disorders, that the process has been very slow. That's one reason initially the 9-month period for the evidence-based review was incorporated into the process. Was to speed things up. However, we understand that it's still a very slow process. And so future reviews might include considering closely related conditions together, such as in a panel, such as for some of the additional lysosomal storage disorders or intellectual disabilities, instead of one condition at a time. No formal action has been taken in this regard yet. Next slide. And then how to incorporate values assessment. Again, something that many of us feel is very important. However, again, it's time consuming, expensive, challenging to do this. Assessing public perspectives, patient and family perspectives. They're, you know, often very individualized, not easily generalizable. And how could we have something in place that could be utilized, such as consumers who are informed about newborn screening already, who could be asked to weigh in about specific conditions. And hopefully there will be more steps taken in the future about this, but at this time no action has been taken, but we hope to have further discussions, further research, and considering how to do this. Next slide. And then for some of the priorities for research and development activities, many of the issues, as I said, will deserve more research and planning, and the priorities will be determined, such as conditions potentially appropriate for newborn screening, and then possibly including the values assessment. So more to come in the future. Next slide. Some of the key issues, I'm not going to go through each one because there's a lot of repetition, but in the red are some of the highlighted things in terms of the nomination package, including specific case definitions for the screening target, including as best as available information is there, what is the incidence in the US for the condition, what phenotypes would be detected, what is the distribution of severity for the known phenotypes, and describe the clinical care required. I think what's often helpful would be in the form of an algorithm where if one were to screen 100,000 newborns, how many approximately would have positive screens? How would those infants need to be assessed in terms of confirmatory testing? Where would they need to go for that? How far would they need to go? What are the current treatments available, the current standard of care? Next slide. What are the clinical indications for treatment? How urgent is that treatment? Is the condition where that baby should be seen, within 24 hours of the state lab reporting out the results, or is it something that, it would be okay to wait a little bit longer? What are some of the contraindications for treatment initiation? And then, is treatment and follow-up available in most hospitals? Would one have to go to a major medical center? Are those treatment centers available? Next slide. What is the modality of the screening sample available? Is there high throughput? Is there, good sensitivity and specificity? Is there need for a second tier type of test? And then what types of validation measures are there? What are the confirmatory testing methods? Are they quantitative or qualitative? Next slide. What is the status of the confirmatory testing? Is there an FDA approved test? Are there pilot studies that have already been done? What were the outcomes of those pilot studies, or any states currently screening for that condition? What has the outcome been of those who were screened positive versus those patients who were diagnosed later on because of their clinical presentation? What would be some of the results, as I said, in states that are already doing this? Is there information from existing registries that could be gathered? And I think we'll try to talk a little bit about that later on. Next slide. And that's it. So sorry to rush through that. I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for discussion. And I'm happy to take questions during the discussion panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, first of all, Dr. Powell, for all that information, and also to the team at HRSA who helped compile all those slides and all that information. Before we move to the panel, just one question that I'm sure is on the minds of some of the people participating, me included. If you're a part of a community that is currently working on developing evidence and compiling a nomination, what are the implications for the new forms that are coming FY 2022 if you're working off of the current forms? What's your guidance to those communities?
Right, so I think the new form will not have to be utilized until next year sometime, and HRSA will give out plenty of notice about that. So currently we're still using the current form.